Victoria Harrington slammed the folder onto the conference table so hard that 2 coffee cups jumped and 50 grown men and women flinched in their chairs. "You will sign this," she said, "or you will walk out that door with nothing." Every eye turned to Ethan Carter. The single father, the man everyone knew, was 1 paycheck away from losing his house. She had him. She always won these moments. But Ethan didn't beg. He didn't argue. He calmly reached up, unclipped his company badge, and set it down beside the folder. And what he said next made a CEO who'd broken 100 people go pale. Before we go on, drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments right now, so I can see how far Ethan's story travels tonight. And if you believe a man's word should still mean something, hit subscribe and follow along, because this one goes places you won't expect. The click of a laptop closing should not be able to silence a room. But it did. Ethan Carter shut the lid of his old company-issued machine, and the small plastic snap of it carried farther than Victoria Harrington's voice ever had. 50 people heard it. 50 people who a moment before had been staring at the floor at their own folded hands at anything but the man being crucified at the front of the room. Now they all looked up. "Ethan?" Victoria's voice was still smooth, still controlled the voice of a woman who had never in 22 years of business needed to raise it. "I don't think you understand what's happening here." "I understand exactly what's happening here," Ethan said. He didn't stand yet. That was the thing people would remember later when they told the story in break rooms and parking lots and at their kitchen tables. He didn't leap up like a hero in a movie. He sat there, steady, a 58-degree calm settling over a man who had every reason to panic. He slid his laptop into the worn canvas backpack he'd carried for 9 years, the one Lily had drawn a little sun on in permanent marker when she was 6. "You have a daughter," Victoria said. Quieter now. A blade wrapped in cotton. "I do," Ethan agreed. "Then think about her." "I am thinking about her," he said. "That's the only reason I'm this calm." Marcus Reed, sitting 3 chairs down, felt his own heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted out. He'd known Ethan for 11 years. They'd started within a month of each other, 2 young guys loading trucks in the freight yard before either of them owned a suit. Marcus had watched this man work 80-hour weeks, watched him bury his wife, and come back to the job 9 days later because he had a mortgage and a little girl and no one else. Marcus had never in 11 years seen Ethan afraid of Victoria Harrington. Everyone else was afraid of her. That was the whole system. That was how it ran. "Let me be very clear," Victoria said, and now she did the thing she always did. She turned slowly and let her gaze travel across the room, letting every single person feel it land on them for half a second. "This restructuring plan is not a suggestion. It is happening. The only question in this room is whether the people who carry it out are the people who get rewarded for it or the people who get replaced by it." She let that hang. "Ethan is choosing to be replaced. That's his right. I want the rest of you to understand it's a choice. Nobody here is a victim." Ethan zipped his backpack. "That's an interesting word," he said. "Victim." "Excuse me. You said nobody here is a victim." He finally stood. The chair rolled back an inch behind him. "You're right. Nobody in this room is a victim. But there are 47 people who aren't in this room. And you're about to make every single one of them one." The temperature of the meeting changed. You could feel it the way you can feel a storm before you see it. Because they all knew the number now. 47. It had been a rumor for 2 weeks, a whisper in the copy room, a half-sentence overheard outside HR. 47 names on a list. Warehouse crew dispatched 2 of the night shift supervisors who'd been with the company since before it was even called Harrington Global. Men and women with 15, 18, 22 years in. And the plan wasn't just to let them go. Ethan had read the document, all of it. Not the summary Victoria had handed out, the actual attachments, the ones buried in the appendix that most people would have skimmed. He'd stayed up until 2 in the morning 3 nights ago reading them, and he'd read them again, and then he'd sat at his kitchen table in the dark and understood that he was looking at something he could not sign his name to. You changed the dates, Ethan said. Victoria's expression did not move. I don't know what you mean. You do. He said it without heat. That was the terrible part. He said it the way you'd tell someone their shoelace was untied. The termination dates. You backdated the restructuring classification so that everyone on that list gets terminated 3 weeks before their benefit vesting completes. 47 people. Some of them are 11 days short. 11 days short of pensions they've been earning for 20 years. Somebody in the back of the room made a small sound. A woman named Dolores, who'd been with the company 19 years and who had a husband on dialysis. She pressed her hand to her mouth. You're framing it as cost reduction, Ethan went on. But you're not reducing a cost. You're taking something people already earned. They did the work. The years are already gone. You're just changing a date on a spreadsheet so you don't have to pay for the years they already gave you. That's a very emotional interpretation of a standard financial process, Victoria said. It's not an interpretation. It's arithmetic. Ethan reached up to his collar. You can call it a process, but a process that's designed to look legal while it robs people who trusted you. I've got a different word for that. And it's not victim, and it's not restructuring. His fingers found the lanyard, the badge that had hung around his neck for 12 years. Harrington Global Logistics, and beneath it his photo from when he was 26, thin-faced and grinning back when he thought a good job at a good company was the whole story. He lifted it over his head. Ethan, Victoria said, and for the first time, the very first time in the memory of anyone in that room, there was something under her voice that wasn't total control. It was small, but it was there. Don't do this. Think. You are a single father. You have a mortgage. You have a 10-year-old. You do not have another job lined up. You do not have a rich family. You do not have a runway. I've read your file. I know exactly what your situation is. And there it was. Marcus felt something turn over in his stomach because he understood in that instant what he was watching. She'd read his file. She'd said it out loud in front of 50 people, like a threat and a mercy at the same time. I know exactly what your situation is. It was the sentence she'd used on 100 employees before. It was the sentence that worked. It was the reason people signed. You can't afford to be a good person. I've done the math on your life, and you can't afford it. Ethan set the badge down on the table. The little plastic clatter of it was somehow louder than the laptop. You're right about all of it, he said. Mortgage, daughter, no job lined up, no rich family. You did read my file. He picked up his backpack and slung it over one shoulder. But there's one line that wasn't in my file, and it's the only line that mattered today. Victoria didn't ask. She didn't have to. The whole room asked it for her, silently leaning in. For 6 years, Ethan said, I've been getting ready for this exact meeting. I didn't know it would be you. I didn't know it would be 47 people. But I knew someday somebody with power was going to look at my life, do the math the way you just did, and decide I was too trapped to say no. He looked at her, and there was no anger in it, which somehow made it worse. And I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to be that man. He turned toward the door. Are you seriously walking away? Victoria said. From 12 years, from everything. Ethan stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. I'm not quitting my job, he said. A pause. I'm refusing to become someone my daughter couldn't respect. And he walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss, and for a full 10 seconds, nobody in that conference room breathed. Then Victoria Harrington did the thing she was very, very good at. She recovered. She smiled a small, professional, disappointed smile, the kind you give when a child has embarrassed themselves at a dinner party. Well, she said, that was a lot of theater for a Tuesday. She smoothed the front of her jacket. Let me be direct with all of you since Mr. Carter chose to make this a performance. This plan proceeds. The list is finalized, and I want the leadership in this room to understand something about what you just saw. She tapped the badge on the table with one manicured finger. You just watched a man throw away his entire future to feel morally superior for 30 seconds. His daughter still needs shoes tomorrow. His mortgage is still due on the 1st. Nothing he said in here pays a single one of his bills. In 6 months, he'll be begging for his job back, and I want every one of you to remember how brave he looked when I have to decide whether to give it to him." It was a good speech. It landed. She saw a couple of heads nod, saw the relief on the faces of people who wanted desperately to believe that Ethan was a fool so they wouldn't have to feel like cowards. But Marcus Reed didn't nod. Marcus was looking at the badge on the table and at the empty chair, and he was thinking about something Ethan had said maybe 2 years ago over cheap beer in Ethan's garage when Marcus had complained about his car payment and his credit cards and how stuck he felt. "You want to know the trap, Marcus," Ethan had said. "The trap isn't the job. The trap is that they know exactly how much you owe. The second they know your number, they own you. So I got rid of my number." Marcus hadn't understood it then. He was starting to understand it now. "Marcus." Victoria's voice cut across the room, and he snapped back to the present. "You've worked alongside Mr. Carter for a long time." 11 years, ma'am." "Then you know his job better than anyone. Congratulations, you're the new operations manager, effective immediately." She slid the folder across the table toward his seat. "Your first task is to execute the restructuring. I trust you understand it more clearly than your predecessor did." Marcus looked at the folder. Everyone looked at Marcus. And here is the thing that Victoria Harrington, for all her cleverness, did not understand about the room she'd just built. She thought she'd made an example of Ethan. She thought she'd shown everyone the cost of defiance. But what she'd actually done was hand every person in that room the same math problem Ethan had solved. She'd shown them live in high definition exactly what it looked like when a man had gotten his number down to 0, and she'd shown them what it looked like when a man hadn't. Because Marcus reached out his hand was not steady, and he pulled the folder toward himself. He had a wife, he had 2 kids, he had a mortgage bigger than Ethan's and a car payment, and a boat he shouldn't have bought, and $11,000 in credit card debt that he hadn't told his wife the full size of. Victoria knew his number too. "Thank you," Marcus heard himself say. "I won't let you down." He hated the sound of his own voice. Ethan Carter drove home in an 11-year-old pickup that started on the second try the way it always did. He did not cry. He did not shake. He did not call anyone. He drove the same route he'd driven 10,000 times past the diner, where he and Marcus used to get eggs before the early shift past the elementary school, where Lily was right now sitting in a 4th-grade classroom, oblivious drawing suns on the corners of her worksheets, the way she drew them on everything. He turned onto his street. Modest houses, small yards, the kind of neighborhood where people still knew each other's names. His house was the blue one that needed painting. The gutter on the left side had been sagging for 2 years, and he kept meaning to fix it, and kept not fixing it because gutters cost money, and money was for one thing only. He pulled into the driveway. He turned off the engine, and he sat there with his hands on the wheel. 12 years. He let himself feel it for exactly as long as it took to feel it, which was not long, because he'd spent 6 years teaching himself that feelings were allowed to visit, but they were not allowed to drive. Then he took out his phone and opened the app for the account. He'd never named it anything clever. Other people named their savings accounts things like Dream Vacation or New Kitchen. His just said, Savings, Do Not Touch. He looked at the number at the top of the screen. He'd looked at it 10,000 times too. He knew it by heart. But he looked at it now the way you look at a bridge right before you find out if it holds. It held. 14 months. That's what the number meant if you translated it from dollars into the only currency that mattered. 14 months of mortgage, groceries, utilities. Lily's everything. The truck, the sagging gutter. He still wasn't going to fix. 14 months of being able to look his daughter in the eye without a single thing changing in her small life. 14 months of the ability to say no. He'd built that, one paycheck at a time. 6 years of driving a truck that embarrassed him a little, 6 years of saying, "We don't need it," to things they could easily have afforded. 6 years of Lily asking why they didn't get the nicer things, and Ethan not knowing how to explain 6 years of a coworker like Marcus buying a boat, while Ethan bought nothing at all except this number, this bridge, this door. His father's voice came to him then, the way it always did at the important moments. The worst prison isn't a locked door, son. It's believing you have no way out. His father had died believing that. His father had stood at a crossroads a lot like this one 30 years ago, and his father had signed. Because his father hadn't built the number. His father had a mortgage and a family and no runway. And when the boss said, "Do it my way or find another job," his father had done it their way, and it had eaten him alive from the inside out for the rest of his life. Not because he was weak. Ethan's father was the strongest man he'd ever known. Because he was trapped. Ethan had watched that. Ethan had learned the one lesson his father accidentally taught him, the lesson that costs everything and saves everything. A man is only as free as his math allows him to be. So fix your math, and then no one can ever make you choose between your bread and your soul. He put the phone away. He went inside. He made a grilled cheese because it was the only thing in the fridge that didn't require a plan, and he ate it standing up at the counter. Then he sat down and did the thing he'd promised himself he'd do first if the day ever came. He got a legal pad and a pen, and he wrote down everything. Every date, every number, every name on that list of 47, the ones he could remember, and he could remember most of them because he knew these people. He knew their kids' names and their coffee orders, and which ones were fighting cancer, and which ones were putting a daughter through nursing school. He wrote down the vesting dates. He wrote down the backdated classifications. He wrote down the exact language in the appendix as close as he could reconstruct it, that turned an ordinary layoff into a coordinated theft of 47 pensions. He did not do this to attack Victoria Harrington. He did it because he was before anything else a man who believed the truth was a thing you kept safe until it was needed, the way you keep a fire extinguisher on the wall. Not because you want the fire, but because the fire doesn't ask your permission. When he was done, he folded the pages and put them in the top drawer of his desk under Lily's old report cards. Then he waited for his daughter to come home. Bam! At 3:15, the front door banged open the way it always did, and a backpack hit the floor, and a 10-year-old voice yelled, "Dad, Marissa said her dad said you got fired. Is that true? Because I told her it was a lie." Ethan came around the corner and Lily stopped. She was 10, and she was sharp, sharper than he sometimes wanted her to be. And she read his face in about a second and a half. And the fight went out of her shoulders, and she said in a much smaller voice, "Oh." Ethan crouched down. "I didn't get fired," he said. Then what happened? He'd thought about how to say this all the way home. He'd rejected a dozen versions. Kids know when you're managing them, Lily especially. So he told her the truth. "My boss asked me to do something that would hurt a lot of people. Take money they'd already earned. 47 of them. Some of them you've met. You remember Miss Dolores from the summer picnic, the one who gave you the extra popsicle?" Lily nodded slowly. "She was on the list, and my boss said if I didn't help her do it, I couldn't work there anymore." Ethan kept his voice even. "So I left." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then, "But that means we don't have money now." And this was the moment, the real one, the one he'd been building toward for 6 years, without knowing what it would look like. Not the conference room. This. His daughter's face doing math a 10-year-old shouldn't have to do. "Come here," Ethan said, and he sat down on the floor right there in the hallway, and she sat with him. "You remember how I always say no when you ask for stuff, the trampoline, the trip to the water park, the new tablet?" "Yeah," Lily said, a little sullen even now. "You know why?" "Because we're poor," she said. And it wasn't mean, it was just what she'd concluded, and it broke his heart a little that she'd concluded it. "We're not poor," Ethan said gently. "We could have had the trampoline. We could have had the water park. Lots of times." He watched this land, watched her frown. "I said no to all of that so I could say yes to today. So that when my boss looked at me and thought he's too broke to do the right thing, she'd be wrong. So that I could walk out of that room and still have a house for you to come home to, and still have food, and still have a dad you don't have to be ashamed of. Lily looked at him with those enormous, serious eyes. For how long? She asked. 10 years old. For how long? She understood the whole thing in 3 words. Long enough, Ethan said. Long enough that you don't have to worry about it. That's my job, not yours. All that saving. It bought us time. It bought us the right to do the right thing without our whole life falling apart. That's what the trampoline turned into, kiddo. It turned into that. Lily thought about this for a while. Then she leaned against his arm. Miss Dolores gave me the extra popsicle, she said quietly. She did. I'm glad you didn't let them hurt Miss Dolores. Ethan closed his eyes for a second. Yeah, he said. Me too. The rumors moved through Harrington Global the way rumors always move, faster than truth and dumber. Carter cracked. Carter finally lost it. 12 years and he throws it all away over some layoffs that weren't even his call. Guy's got a kid too. What a way to blow up your life. Most people believed the worst version because the worst version let them feel better about the fact that they'd stayed. If Ethan was a hothead, a fool, a man who'd self-destructed, then staying quiet in that conference room wasn't cowardice. It was maturity. It was being a grown-up. It was understanding how the world works. Victoria encouraged this reading without ever saying a word she could be quoted on. She was too smart for that. She simply mentioned in a leadership meeting that she wished Ethan the best and hoped he'd find something that suited his temperament. She said it kindly. It was devastating. By the end of the week, half the company thought of Ethan Carter as a cautionary tale. But there was a smaller group. And this group didn't say much, and they didn't say it loudly, but they'd noticed something. They'd noticed that Ethan Carter had never once in 12 years been wrong about a number. The man was the best operations manager the company had ever had, precisely because he was careful, thorough, and constitutionally unable to overstate anything. He didn't panic. He didn't exaggerate. If Ethan said a shipment would be 3 days late, it was late by 3 days, not 2, not 4. If Ethan said a route wouldn't work, it didn't work. In 11 years of working beside him, Marcus Reed had never once seen Ethan raise his voice over something that wasn't real. So when a man like that closes his laptop, sets down his badge, and calmly says, "You're stealing 47 people's pensions," a certain kind of person hears that and thinks, he doesn't do drama. So what does he know that I don't? Dolores was one of those people. Dolores had been 11 days from vesting, and she hadn't known it. And she found out 3 days after Ethan walked out, when her termination letter arrived with a date on it that made no sense to her. She sat at her kitchen table and looked at the date and thought about her husband on dialysis and the health coverage that was about to disappear, and then she thought about the way Ethan Carter, careful, quiet. Never wrong Ethan Carter had said the word dates in that meeting, and she picked up the phone and called 2 other people on the list. Marcus Reed could not sleep. He'd been the operations manager for 6 days. 6 days, and he'd already signed things he didn't want to think about too hard. He'd sat in his new office in Ethan's old chair, and he'd processed the paperwork for the restructuring the way Victoria told him to. And every night he came home, and his wife asked how the new job was going, and he said, "Great big raise," and she was happy, and he lay awake. On the 7th night, he got up at 2 a.m. and went down to the kitchen and got out his own legal pad. Funny, he'd thought that Ethan always used a legal pad, that Ethan didn't trust anything important to a screen, and he started doing the thing Ethan would have done. He did the math himself. He pulled up the classification dates. He cross-referenced them against the vesting schedule, which he had access to now in a way he hadn't before. And what he found made his hands go cold, because Ethan had been right. Of course, Ethan had been right. Ethan was always right about numbers. Every single termination date on that list had been moved. Not by much. Just enough. Just enough to land each person on the wrong side of a line they didn't know existed. Marcus sat in his kitchen at 2 a.m. and understood that he was now the man executing the exact crime Ethan had refused to execute. That the promotion, the raise, the big office, all of it was payment for being willing to do the thing that a better man had walked away from. You want to know the trap, Marcus? The trap is that they know your number. Marcus put his head in his hands. He didn't do anything that night. He wasn't Ethan. He didn't have 14 months in a do-not-touch account. He had $11,000 in credit card debt, and a wife who didn't know how much, and 2 kids, and a boat, and a number so big that Victoria Harrington could read it from across a conference room. But he took the legal pad, and he folded the pages, and he put them in his coat pocket instead of shredding them. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with them. He just knew he couldn't throw them away, and that one small refusal, that keeping of the pages, was the first crack. Not in Victoria's plan. In the wall she'd built around every person who worked for her. The wall made of I know your number. The wall that Ethan Carter had climbed over 6 years ago, one paycheck at a time, and that everyone else had just assumed was too high. Ethan didn't hear about any of this. Ethan spent his days doing the things a suddenly unemployed single father does when he spent 6 years making sure that being suddenly unemployed wouldn't be an emergency. He fixed the sagging gutter. Turned out he'd been putting it off for 2 years, and it took him 40 minutes and $11 in parts. And he stood on the ladder afterward, feeling like an idiot for having dreaded it. He made Lily's lunches. He walked her to school, and he was there when she got out, which he hadn't been in years, and she pretended to be embarrassed by it and was secretly thrilled. He updated his resume. He made calls. Not desperate ones. Careful ones. He had 14 months. He wasn't going to take the first thing that came along and land himself in another version of the same room with a different Victoria. He'd built the runway precisely so he could choose well, and he was going to choose well. And in the evenings after Lily was asleep, he sometimes took out the folded pages from the top drawer of his desk and read them over. Not because he was planning anything, but because he wanted to be sure, dead sure, that if the day came when someone asked him what he'd seen, he could say it exactly calmly and be right. Because he suspected the day would come. Not because of anything he would do. He'd meant what he told Marcus once, and what he'd meant when he walked out of that room, he hadn't left to prove he was right. He'd left because he knew he was right, and there is a very great difference between those two things. And it is the whole difference between a man who needs the world to agree with him and a man who doesn't. He hadn't leaked anything. He wouldn't. He hadn't called a reporter or a lawyer or posted a single word online. He'd simply told the truth once in a room to the one person who most needed to hear it, and then he'd gone home to his daughter. But the truth is a strange kind of tenant. You can keep it in a drawer. You can keep it quiet. But it has a way of knocking on other doors when you're not looking, of showing up in a woman's kitchen, when her termination letter arrives with the wrong date on it, of waking a coworker at 2 a.m. and putting a legal pad in his hands. Ethan didn't know that Dolores had called 2 other people. He didn't know that those 2 people had called 4 more. He didn't know that 6 days after he set his badge down on that table, there were 9 people at Harrington Global quietly comparing termination dates against a vesting schedule, and that all 9 of them were finding the same thing, and that every one of them was thinking the same 3 words. Carter was right. He didn't know that Marcus Reed was lying awake at night with folded pages in his coat pocket, unable to throw them away, and unable yet to use them. Ethan didn't know any of it. He was standing at his kitchen counter on a Thursday evening making grilled cheese. He'd gotten good at grilled cheese and helping Lily with a worksheet about fractions, and when she asked him for the 4th time why 1/2 was bigger than 1/3, when 3 was bigger than 2, he set down the spatula and drew her a pizza on the back of the worksheet and cut it 2 ways and watched her face do the thing it did when something clicked. "Oh," Lily said. "The pieces are bigger when there's less of them." "That's it," Ethan said. "Fewer pieces, bigger pieces." Lily considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. "Is that why we don't have a lot of stuff?" she asked. "So our pieces are bigger." Ethan looked at his daughter for a long moment. "Yeah, kiddo," he said quietly. "That's exactly why." And across town in this dark, a woman named Dolores was dialing a 10th number, and a man named Marcus was staring at the ceiling, and in a corner office, a CEO named Victoria Harrington was reviewing a restructuring plan she was absolutely certain had gone perfectly certain of it, the way she was certain of everything, right up until the moment she wasn't. She had judged Ethan Carter by what she could see. She had never once in 22 years thought to ask what a quiet man might have spent 6 years building where no one could see it. She was about to find out. Marcus Reed made it 11 days before he broke. 11 days of sitting in Ethan's old chair signing Ethan's old signature line processing paperwork that turned 19 years of Dolores Whitfield's life into a date on a spreadsheet that landed her 11 days short of everything. 11 days of coming home and telling his wife the new job was great. 11 days of the folded legal pad pages riding around in his coat pocket like a second heartbeat he couldn't turn off. On the 11th day, Dolores came to his office. She didn't knock. She just opened the door, walked in and set a piece of paper on his desk, and she said, "Marcus, look at this and tell me it's a mistake." He looked at it. It was her termination letter. It had a date on it. "Now look at this," she said, and she set down a second piece of paper. It was a printout of the company's benefit vesting schedule, the one that showed exactly when an employee crossed from earning a pension to having one. She'd circled her own name. She'd circled the date. And the two dates were 11 days apart, and the wrong one came first. "I've been here 19 years, Dolores said. Her voice was steady, which was worse than if it had shaken. "My husband's on dialysis 3 times a week. Our whole insurance is through me. And somebody moved my last day so it lands 11 days before I get the thing I've been working 19 years for. Marcus, you process these. You tell me. Is that an accident?" Marcus opened his mouth. He was going to say, "I don't know." He'd rehearsed it. "I don't have visibility into the classification logic." "Dolores, that's above my level. Let me look into it." He'd said versions of it to 4 other people that week. It was a good sentence. It was a coward sentence, and he knew it, and it had gotten him through 4 other conversations. But Dolores was looking at him. And she'd worked in the same building as him for 19 years, and her husband was on dialysis, and Marcus was so tired. "No?" Marcus heard himself say, "It's not an accident." Dolores didn't move. "Say it again," she said. "It's not an accident." His voice cracked on accident. "Somebody moved it on purpose. Somebody moved all of them on purpose. 47 of them. So the company doesn't have to pay out the pensions." He put his face in his hands. Ethan was right. Ethan was right about everything, and I've been sitting here doing the thing he wouldn't do, and I've been telling myself it wasn't my call. And Dolores, it was my call. I signed your letter. My name is on it. Dolores sat down across from him slowly. "Ethan knew," she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan read the appendix. Nobody reads the appendix. Ethan read the appendix at 2 in the morning, and he did the math, and he stood up in that room, and he said the word dates, and I thought, God help me. I thought he was overreacting. I thought he'd finally cracked. 12 years, and I thought he'd cracked because that was easier than thinking what it actually meant. "Which is what?" Marcus looked up. "Which is that a man I've known for 11 years just torched his whole life to try to protect you. And it didn't even work. Because I took his chair the next morning and finished the job for a 15% raise." The office was quiet. Then Dolores said the thing that Marcus would think about for the rest of his life. "So, untake it," she said. And that was the first crack you could actually see. Not the private one in Marcus's kitchen at 2 in the morning. This one, out loud in an office with a witness. The wall Victoria had built around Marcus, the wall made of $11,000 in credit card debt, and a boat he shouldn't have bought, and a number she could read from across a room. That wall didn't come down all at once. But Dolores put a crack in it with 3 words, and the crack held. "I've got a wife," Marcus said. 2 kids. If I do anything, if I so much as breathe wrong, she fires me the way she fired Ethan, except she'll make sure nobody hires me again. You don't cross Victoria Harrington and land on your feet. Ethan's the exception. Ethan spent 6 years building a runway. I don't have a runway, Dolores. I've got debt." "So did Ethan's dad," Dolores said. Marcus blinked. "What?" "Ethan told me once. At a picnic years ago. About his father. Said his old man got put in a room just like the one Ethan got put in 30 years ago, and his old man signed because he was scared, because he had a family, because he had debt. And Ethan said his father was the strongest man he ever knew, and it still ate him alive because he spent the rest of his life knowing he'd done the wrong thing for the right reasons. Dolores leaned forward. Ethan didn't walk out of that room because he's braver than you, Marcus. He walked out because he watched his father not, and he decided a long time ago which one he was going to be, that's all. That's the whole difference. He decided early, and you're deciding right now today in this chair. Marcus stared at her. That's a lot of pressure to put on a guy, he said weakly. You put your name on my letter, Dolores said. You want to talk about pressure talk to my husband about what happens to his dialysis in 11 days. And Marcus Reed, who had $11,000 in debt and no runway, and 2 kids and every reason in the world to keep his head down, reached into his coat pocket and took out the folded legal pad pages, and he set them on the desk between them, and he said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." Dolores looked at the pages. "What's this?" "It's every date, cross-referenced against every vesting deadline, all 47. In my handwriting for my access, which means I can't pretend I didn't know." Marcus's hands were shaking, but his voice for the first time in 11 days was not. "You asked me to untake it. This is me untaking it. I don't know how yet. I don't know if it works. But you've got 9 people, right? You've been calling people." Dolores nodded slowly. "Get me all 9. Everybody who's been comparing their dates. We do this careful. We do this the way Ethan would do it. We don't go loud. We don't go to the news. We don't do anything that Victoria can call hysterical or a disgruntled employee smear campaign, because that's her whole game. That's how she wins. She makes it about your emotions instead of her arithmetic." He tapped the pages. "We make it about the arithmetic. Numbers on paper. Dates that don't lie. And we do one thing Ethan couldn't do." "What?" Ethan walked out before he could get proof. He knew, but he couldn't take the documents. He wasn't going to steal company files. That's not who he is. But I'm the operations manager now. Marcus almost laughed, and there was something terrible in it. "She gave me the keys. She promoted me into the one seat that can see everything. She was so busy making an example out of Ethan that she handed the evidence to the guy she thought she'd bought." Dolores looked at him for a long moment. "You sure about this, Marcus?" "No," Marcus said honestly. "I'm sure about $11,000 in debt. I'm sure I'm going to have to tell my wife the real number tonight. I'm sure this might blow up my whole life." He picked up his pen. "But I watched a better man than me set his badge on a table 12 days ago, and I've been sick to my stomach every single day since, and I finally figured out why. It's because when it was my turn, I signed. And I don't want to be the guy who signed. Not anymore." That night, Marcus told his wife the real number. All of it. The 11,000 in credit cards. The boat. The way he'd been lying to her not with words, but with silences for 2 years. He sat at their kitchen table, and he laid his whole cowardice out on the table, like a hand of cards he was finally done bluffing with, and he told her what he'd done at work, and what he was about to do, and what it might cost them. He was braced for her to be furious. About the money. About the risk. About all of it. Instead, she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "You remember when your dad's plant closed, and they cheated all those guys out of the severance, and your dad talked about it for 20 years. Yeah. You want your kids talking about you like that bitter for 20 years? She reached across the table and took his hand. Or you want them talking about the time their dad did something hard because it was right. She squeezed. We'll figure out the money, Marcus. We always figure out the money. There's only one thing you can't fix later, and it's who you were when it counted. So don't screw that part up. The money will fix. Marcus put his head down on the kitchen table and cried for the first time since he was a boy. Then he got up, and he got his laptop, and he started copying dates. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Carter had a job interview. It was a good one. A regional distribution outfit smaller than Harrington, but solid family-owned, the kind of place where the owner still walked the floor and knew people's names. They'd found Ethan's resume and called him, and he'd done his homework the way he did everything, and he sat across from a man named Frank Delgado, who'd built the company from 3 trucks and a warehouse over 30 years. Frank looked at the resume. 12 years at Harrington, operations manager. That's a big chair. Why'd you leave? And here was the moment. Ethan could have said anything. He could have said restructuring. He could have said seeking new challenges. He could have said any of the smooth, safe, nothing words that people say, and Frank would have nodded and moved on, and it would have been fine. Ethan set his coffee down. I left because my CEO asked me to backdate the termination dates on 47 people so the company wouldn't have to pay pensions. Those people had already earned, Ethan said, and I wouldn't do it. So she told me to do it her way or quit, and I quit. Frank Delgado sat back in his chair. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. And Ethan thought, well, there it goes, because that's not the kind of thing you say in a job interview. That's the kind of thing that makes a man wonder if you're a troublemaker, a liability, a guy who's going to be a problem. Then Frank said, "You got proof?" "No," Ethan said. "I didn't take any documents. I don't have a single piece of paper. I read the appendix, I did the math, and I told her the truth, and I walked out. So all I've got is my word and my memory. Which means if you call Harrington for a reference, they'll tell you I abandoned my post over a personality conflict, and there's nothing I can say to that except that I know what I saw." Frank studied him. "Most guys," Frank said slowly, "would have lied to me just now, made it about seeking new opportunities, and I'd have hired some of them and found out later they were the kind of guy who tells you what you want to hear." He leaned forward. "You just told me a story that makes you look risky, in a job interview, because it was true. And you didn't dress it up, and you didn't pretend you had proof you don't have." "I'm not going to start a job by lying about why I left the last one." Frank laughed. It was a real laugh. "Son," he said, "I've been running this business 30 years, and I'll tell you the one thing I know for sure. You can teach a man logistics. You can't teach him that." He tapped the resume. "Here's my problem, though. I got a position, but it doesn't open for 6 weeks. Guy's retiring, moving to Arizona, but he's not gone yet. Can you wait 6 weeks? Ethan thought about the number in the Do Not Touch account. 14 months. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I can wait 6 weeks." "Then let's talk again in 5. Frank stood up and shook his hand. "And Ethan, that thing you did, walking out. For what it's worth, from a stranger, most people can't afford to do that. Not because they're bad people. Because they're broke and scared and stuck. You did something most people literally cannot do. I hope you know that's rare." Ethan drove home from that interview and did not tell anyone how good it felt. He didn't have anyone to tell really except Lily, and he wasn't going to put grown-up relief on a 10-year-old. But he sat in the truck in his driveway for a minute, the way he had the day he walked out. Except this time, it was a different feeling entirely, and he let himself feel it for exactly as long as it took. I can wait 6 weeks, 6 years of a truck that embarrassed him. 6 years of no water park, no trampoline, no boat. 6 years of Lily thinking they were poor. And all of it had just turned into 3 words he could say to a good man in an interview without flinching: "I can wait." His father never got to say those words. His father's whole life turned on the fact that he couldn't wait. Couldn't say no, couldn't afford his own conscience. And Ethan had spent 6 years making absolutely sure that when his turn came, the math would be on his side. The math was on his side. He went inside and made grilled cheese. He still didn't know about Marcus. He didn't know about Dolores, or the 9 people, or the legal pad pages, or any of it. He'd told the truth once in a room and gone home to his daughter, and he'd meant it when he said he didn't leave to prove he was right. So he wasn't watching Harrington. He wasn't refreshing anything. He was helping Lily with fractions and making calls about a job that started in 6 weeks and fixing the things around the house he'd been putting off for years because he'd finally, for once in his life, had the time. But the truth he'd folded into the top drawer of his desk was at that very moment being copied out in a coward-turned-brave man's handwriting, cross-referenced against a vesting schedule and multiplied by 9. Marcus worked for 6 nights straight. He was careful. He was so careful. He didn't email anything. He didn't put anything on the company servers where it could be traced or deleted. He did it the way Ethan would have done it, on paper by hand, one date at a time, cross-referencing the classification records he had legitimate access to against the vesting deadlines he now had legitimate access to, and building slowly, painstakingly, a document that showed in black and white that every single one of the 47 termination dates had been moved, and that every single move landed the employee on the wrong side of their pension. 47 names, 47 original dates, 47 altered dates, 47 vesting deadlines, and a pattern so clean, so deliberate, so obviously coordinated that no one could look at it and call it a coincidence. Dolores got him the 9 people. Then the 9 became 14. The 14 signed statements, simple ones. Just, this is my termination date. This is my vesting date. I was not told I was being terminated before I vested. 14 signatures. 14 human beings willing to put their names on paper. And on the 6th night, Marcus looked at what he'd built and he realized he had a problem. He had the truth. He had it cold. But he didn't know what to do with it. Because you couldn't just hand it to Victoria. She'd bury it and she'd fire him. And she'd fire all 14. And she'd find a way to make it look like a disgruntled cabal. And you couldn't just go to the news. Ethan's instinct there was right. Victoria would turn it into a smear, disgruntled ex-employees' personality conflicts, sour grapes. And you couldn't go to a lawyer without money, and none of these people had money. That was the whole point. That was why Victoria had picked them. Marcus sat at his kitchen table at 2 in the morning with the truth in his hands and no idea where to put it. And then he thought about the one person who might. He drove to Ethan's house the next evening. He hadn't spoken to Ethan since the meeting, hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't been able to face him. He'd taken Ethan's chair. He'd finished Ethan's dirty work. He didn't know if Ethan would even open the door. He knocked. Ethan opened the door, and there was a beat, a long one, where the 2 men just looked at each other. 11 years of friendship and 13 days of silence, all of it in the space of one open doorway. "Marcus," Ethan said. "I took your chair," Marcus said. He didn't even say hello. It just came out. "The morning after you walked out, she offered me your job and a raise, and I took it, and I've been finishing the layoffs, and I processed Dolores's letter with my own hand, and I've been telling myself it wasn't my call, and I couldn't come see you because I couldn't look at you." His voice broke. "I'm sorry, man. I'm so sorry." Ethan looked at his friend for a long moment. "You want to come in?" he said. "Lily's asleep. I got coffee on." And that was it. That was the whole absolution. Ethan didn't make him grovel. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't even look surprised, which somehow made Marcus feel both better and worse better, because there was no anger in it. Worse, because it meant Ethan had known Marcus would take the chair. Had known and hadn't held it against him, because he understood exactly why a man with 11,000 in debt does what a man with 11,000 in debt does. They sat at Ethan's kitchen table, the same table where Ethan had written out the truth 13 days ago, and Marcus put his own pages on it. Ethan read them slowly. He read every line. 47 names, 47 altered dates, 14 signatures. He read it the way he read everything carefully without reacting. And Marcus watched his face and couldn't tell what he was thinking, and it was maddening. And it was exactly why Ethan was Ethan. Finally, Ethan set the pages down. "This is good work," he said quietly. "This is careful. This is real. You didn't do it on the servers. No, paper, by hand, like you. 14 signed statements. Started with 9, words spreading. It'll be 20 by the weekend." Ethan nodded slowly. Then he said, "Why'd you bring it to me?" And Marcus said, "Because I don't know what to do with it. I've got the truth, and I don't know where to put it. If I hand it to Victoria, she buries it and fires all of us. If I go to the news, she smears us. If I go to a lawyer, I can't afford one. I've got the whole thing. Ethan, I've got her cold, and I'm stuck because she built it, so we'd be stuck, and I don't—" He stopped. "You're the only person I know who ever got unstuck, so I came to the guy who got unstuck." Ethan was quiet for a while. Then he stood up, and he went to his desk, and he opened the top drawer, and he took out his own folded pages from under Lily's report cards. and he brought them back and set them next to Marcus's. "You know what I've had in my drawer for 13 days, Ethan said. "The same thing you just built. My version. From memory. Everything I read in that appendix, written down the night I walked out, so that if the day ever came when somebody asked me what I saw, I could say it exactly and be right." Marcus stared at the two sets of pages side by side. "You've had this the whole time," he said, "and you didn't do anything with it." "No." "Why not?" And Ethan said something Marcus would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Because it wasn't mine to blow up," Ethan said. "I walked out to save myself. To not be a man my daughter couldn't respect. That was my fight, and I won it the second I set the badge down." But blowing up the company, exposing Victoria, getting 47 people their pensions back, that was never going to happen because one guy went to the newspaper with a story he couldn't prove. It was only ever going to happen if the people it happened to stood up, if Dolores compared her dates, if you did the math, if 14 people signed their names. He tapped Marcus's pages. "I couldn't do this, not because I didn't want to, because it's not the kind of thing one man can do from the outside. I could only do my part, and my part was refusing, loudly enough that somebody like Dolores would remember I never overreact and start asking questions." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. "You planned this?" "No," Ethan said. "God, no. I didn't plan any of this. When I walked out, I thought I was just walking out. I thought I was saving my own soul and losing my career, and that was the whole story. I didn't know Dolores would call anybody. I didn't know you'd take the chair and then not be able to sleep. I couldn't have planned it. But I knew one thing." He looked at his friend. "I knew the truth doesn't need me to carry it. It just needs one person to say it out loud without flinching, and then it finds its own way to the other doors. I said it. That was my job. What happens after that was never up to me." Marcus looked at the two sets of pages, the two men who'd separately in the dark, on paper by hand, written down the same truth. "So what do we do now?" Marcus asked. "You know where to put it. I know you know. That's why I'm here." Ethan almost smiled. "There's a board," he said. "Harrington's got a board of directors. Victoria answers to them technically, even if they mostly rubber stamp whatever she wants because she makes them money. There's a woman on it, Eleanor Voss, old money type, sat on the board for 20 years. Victoria hates her because Eleanor's the one person on that board who isn't afraid of her because Eleanor doesn't need the job and doesn't need the money and can't be bought or scared." Ethan tapped the pages. "You don't take this to Victoria. You take it to Eleanor Voss. You take her 47 names, 47 altered dates, 20 signed statements, and you let her do the math herself because she'll do it. She's sharp, and once Eleanor Voss has done the math, there is nothing Victoria can do to make it go away. Because you can't fire a board member. You can't smear a woman who's been respected in this city for 40 years. You can't outpower the one person with more power than you." Marcus sat very still. "How do you know all this?" 12 years, Ethan said. "You pay attention for 12 years, you learn where the real power is. Victoria's power came from fear. Eleanor's comes from not being afraid. There's only one thing in this whole world that beats a person who rules by fear, Marcus, and it's a person who can't be made afraid." He slid both sets of pages across the table. "Take mine too. Not because you need it, your version's better, you had the access, but because if this ever goes to a lawyer or a court, it matters that two people separately wrote down the same truth on the same nights before we ever talked. That's not two disgruntled employees comparing notes. That's two men who independently saw the same crime. That's the kind of thing that can't be explained away." Marcus took the pages. "You could come with me," he said. "To Eleanor. It'd be stronger with you there. The guy who walked out, the guy who saw it first." And Ethan shook his head. "No," he said. "This is yours now. You built the document. You got the signatures. You're the one still inside, the one with the access, the one taking the real risk. I already had my day in that conference room. If I show up now, it becomes a revenge story, the fired manager coming back to settle a score. And Victoria would love that she'd know exactly what to do with that." He looked at Marcus steadily. but a current employee, the newly promoted operations manager, walking into a board member's office with 20 signed statements and 47 altered dates saying I was told to do this, and I can prove it's wrong. She doesn't know what to do with that. There's no revenge angle. There's no disgruntled angle. There's just a man who found out he was being used to hurt people and decided to stop. Ethan almost smiled again. That's a better story than mine, Marcus. And it's true. Go tell it. Marcus looked down at the pages in his hands. 2 sets. 2 men. The same truth written in the dark on the same nights. Ethan, he said, when you walked out of that room, when you set the badge down, everybody thought you were finished. I thought you were finished. Victoria stood up after you left and gave this whole speech about how you'd be back begging in 6 months. He looked up. And instead, you're sitting here in your kitchen, calm as anything, and you've already got a new job lined up, and you're the one who knows exactly how to take her down, and you're handing it to me instead of doing it yourself because you don't even need the credit. He shook his head slowly. How are you not scared? How were you never scared? And Ethan Carter looked at his old friend, and he thought about his father, and he thought about 6 years of a truck that embarrassed him, and a daughter who thought they were poor, and a do-not-touch account that said 14 months, and he thought about the moment he'd set the badge down and felt for the first time in his life completely free. Because a long time ago, Ethan said, I stopped letting anybody else know my number. And the day you do that, Marcus, the day nobody can look at your life and figure out exactly how much you can't afford to lose, that's the day they stop being able to make you afraid. He picked up his coffee. Victoria's whole power was that she knew everybody's number. She read your file. She read mine. She read 47 files and picked the people who were 11 days from a pension, because 11 days from a pension people can't afford to fight. She built her whole kingdom on knowing what people couldn't afford to lose. He set the coffee down. She just never met somebody who'd spent 6 years making sure the answer was nothing. Marcus stood up. He held the pages against his chest. I'm gonna go see Eleanor Voss, he said. I know, Ethan said. Tomorrow. Good. Marcus got to the door and stopped. He turned around. Dolores was right about you, he said. She said you didn't walk out because you were braver than the rest of us. She said you walked out because you watched your dad not 30 years ago, and you decided early which one you were gonna be. He swallowed. I decided late, Ethan. I decided 13 days late. But I decided. Ethan looked at his friend for a long moment. Late still counts, he said quietly. It always counts. My dad never got to decide at all. You decided. That's the whole ballgame, Marcus. That's everything. Marcus nodded, and there was something wet in his eyes, and he didn't try to hide it. Go home, Ethan said gently. Kiss your wife. Tell your kids you love them. And tomorrow you go see Eleanor Voss, and you put the truth on her desk, and you let go of it, because once it's on her desk, it's out of your hands, and it stops being your weight to carry. He almost smiled. That's the part nobody tells you. The truth is heavy right up until you set it down in front of the right person. Then it's light. Then it's the lightest thing in the world. Marcus left. Ethan cleaned up the 2 coffee cups, and he checked on Lily, who was asleep with her math worksheet still on the nightstand, the little pizza he'd drawn her cut into halves and thirds. He stood in her doorway for a minute, the way parents do. Then he went to his desk, and he closed the top drawer, the one that was empty now for the first time in 13 days, and he felt the strange lightness of it, of the truth being gone, of it being on its way to the right door at last. He hadn't done it. That was the thing he'd carry, the thing that made it different from every revenge story anyone would ever try to tell about him. He hadn't blown up Victoria Harrington. He'd just refused to become her once out loud in a room, and then he'd gone home and made grilled cheese and helped his daughter understand why fewer pieces are bigger pieces. And somewhere in the 13 days between his refusal and this moment, that one true thing he'd said had walked out of the conference room on its own 2 feet. Found Dolores at her kitchen table. Woken Marcus at 2 a.m, gathered 20 signatures, and turned itself into a document that was at this very moment sitting in a folder on Marcus Reed's passenger seat, pointed at the one office in the whole company that Victoria Harrington could not reach. And Victoria Harrington had no idea. She was that same night at a charity gala across town in a gold dress accepting an award for corporate leadership. She gave a gracious speech about the responsibility that comes with power. She thanked her team. She said, and she meant it, that a company is only as strong as the trust it builds. The room applauded. She smiled the smile she'd smiled 1,000 times, the one that had broken 100 employees, and she believed, she truly completely believed, that she had handled the Ethan Carter situation perfectly. That the restructuring had gone off without a hitch, that the 47 were quietly gone and forgotten, and that the one troublemaker had removed himself. She had judged the whole thing by what she could see. She could not see Marcus Reed's passenger seat. She could not see the 20 signatures. She could not see the 2 sets of legal pad pages written in the dark on the same nights by 2 men who'd separately looked at the same crime and refused to sign their names to it. And she could not see the appointment Marcus had made under a vague, harmless subject line for 9 o'clock the next morning in the private office of Eleanor Voss, the one board member in the entire Harrington empire who had never, not once in 20 years, been afraid of her. Victoria Harrington finished her speech to warm applause, and she raised her glass, and she had no idea that the door was already built, and that someone was at that very moment driving it straight toward he. Marcus Reed did not sleep the night before he saw Eleanor Voss. He lay awake beside his wife, and around 3 in the morning, she rolled over and found his eyes open in the dark, and she didn't ask if he was okay because she knew he wasn't, and asking would have been a lie between them, and they were done with lies. Instead, she put her hand flat on his chest over his heart and she said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, you come home to us the same man who left this morning. That's all I need. Not a hero, just the guy who finally stopped lying to himself. Come home as him." And Marcus lay there with his wife's hand on his heart and thought, "I've been afraid of the wrong thing my whole life." He'd been afraid of losing the job, the boat, the raise. He'd never once been afraid of losing this, of becoming a man his wife had to put her hand over his heart to recognize. He'd had it backward for 41 years. At 8:52 the next morning, he sat in his truck outside a building he'd never had reason to enter with a folder on the passenger seat that contained 47 names, 47 altered dates, 22 signed statements. Dolores had gotten 2 more overnight, and 2 sets of legal pad pages written in the dark by 2 different men. At 8:55, he walked in. Eleanor Voss was 71 years old and did not stand when he entered because she'd stopped standing for people to prove things a long time ago. She looked at him over a pair of reading glasses and said, "You're the new operations manager, the one who replaced Carter." It wasn't a question. She knew exactly who he was. "Yes, ma'am." "Sit." He sat. "Your appointment request said, and I quote," Eleanor said dryly, "a routine operational matter regarding restructuring documentation, which is the kind of thing I'd normally decline because I've been on this board 20 years, and nobody schedules a private meeting with me at 9 in the morning about routine documentation." She took off her glasses. "So let's not waste each other's time. Why are you really here, Mr. Reed?" And Marcus, who had rehearsed 100 careful openings, threw all of them out and said the true thing. "Because Victoria Harrington ordered me to steal 47 pensions, and I did it for 11 days, and then a woman named Dolores, whose husband is on dialysis, asked me to untake it, and I couldn't figure out how. So I went to the one man who'd already said no, and he told me the only person in this whole company who can't be fired, smeared, or scared is you." Eleanor Voss went very still. "Ethan Carter told you to come to me," she said. "You know Ethan." "I know of Ethan. I know he's the operations manager who walked out of a meeting 2 weeks ago and set his badge on the table." Victoria described it to the board as an emotional resignation over a personality conflict. She was very sympathetic about it. Said she hoped he'd get help. Eleanor's mouth thinned. "I've been on this board 20 years, Mr. Reed. I've heard Victoria be sympathetic about a lot of people right before they disappeared. So, you've got 2 minutes to make me believe your version instead of hers. Go." Marcus opened the folder. He didn't make a speech. Ethan's voice was in his head. Make it about the arithmetic numbers on paper dates that don't lie. And so he laid it out flat, 1 page at a time, the way Ethan would have. Here are the 47 names. Here is each person's original termination date, the one that was in the system before the restructuring. Here is each person's altered date, the one that went into the letters. And here in the third column is each person's pension vesting deadline. And Eleanor, look at the pattern. Every altered date lands before the vesting deadline. Every single one. 19 days short, 11 days short, 6 days short. Never after. Never once after. 47 times, the date moved to exactly the wrong side of the line. Eleanor Voss put her glasses back on. She read it herself. She didn't take his word for it. She went down the columns with one finger, name by name, date by date, and Marcus sat in silence and watched a 71-year-old woman do the exact math that Ethan had done at 2 in the morning, that Marcus had done at his kitchen table, that Dolores had done when her letter came, and he watched her arrive in real time, at the same place all of them had arrived. She got to the bottom of the page. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said without looking up, "This isn't a coincidence." "No, ma'am. You can't move 47 dates in 47 different directions and have them all happen to land on the wrong side of the pension line. That's not restructuring. That's a machine. Somebody built a machine to do this." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor took off her glasses again slowly, and this time when she looked at Marcus, there was something different in her face, something old and hard and furious in a way that had nothing to do with volume. 22 signatures, she said, tapping the statements. These are real people, current and former employees, willing to put their names down. It was 9 when I started. It's 22 this morning. Dolores keeps finding more. She said it'll be 30 by the weekend. Marcus swallowed. They're not scared anymore, Ms. Voss. That's the thing Victoria doesn't understand. She built the whole thing on people being too scared and too broke to fight. But once one person said no out loud, once Ethan set that badge down, people started doing the math. And you can't unknow a number once you've seen it. Eleanor Voss sat back in her chair. You understand what you've done by coming here, she said. You understand that the moment I act on this, Victoria will know it came from inside operations, and there's exactly one person in operations with the access to build this document. She'll know it was you, and Victoria Harrington does not forgive. I know. You've got a family. I've read the same files she reads, Mr. Reed. I know you've got 2 kids and a mortgage, and forgive me, a boat you probably shouldn't have bought. Marcus almost laughed at that. You're not a man who can afford to lose this job. So why are you sitting in my office handing me the thing that's going to cost you your job? And Marcus gave her the answer he'd found at his own kitchen table, the one his wife had put into his hands. Because my dad worked at a plant that closed when I was a kid, he said. And they cheated all the guys out of their severance, and my dad talked about it for 20 years. Bitter. Every holiday. Every time he had a couple beers. 20 years of they cheated us, and nobody did anything. Marcus's voice was steady now, steadier than it had been in weeks. And I've got 2 kids. And I finally figured out I get to pick which story they tell about me for 20 years. The one where their dad helped steal 47 pensions for a 15% raise. Or the one where he stopped. That's the whole choice. And I can't afford the job, Ms. Voss, you're right. But I really can't afford the first story. Eleanor Voss looked at him for a long, long moment. Then she picked up her phone. Cancel my 10 o'clock, she said into it. Cancel my whole morning. And get me the general counsel. No, not Victoria's counsel, the board's counsel. Harold, the outside firm. Get me Harold Beck on the phone in the next 15 minutes and tell him it's the kind of thing he clears his calendar for. She hung up. She looked at Marcus. You just started something you can't stop, Mr. Reed. I want you to understand that. As of right now, this is out of your hands. It's in mine, and I don't lose. Marcus felt the weight come off his chest so fast it almost hurt, and he understood what Ethan had meant. The truth is heavy right up until you set it down in front of the right person. Then it's the lightest thing in the world. Ethan said that too, Marcus said quietly. That once it was on the right desk, it had stopped being mine to carry. Ethan Carter. Eleanor said, sounds like a smarter man than the one Victoria described to this board. She stood up. She did stand now for this, and she extended her hand. Go back to work, Mr. Reed. Act normal. Say nothing. Let me pull the thread. And when it unravels, and it will unravel, you keep your head down, and let me be the one holding the scissors. You've done your part. Let an old woman who can't be fired do the rest." Marcus shook her hand and left, and he sat in his truck in the parking lot, and for the second time in 2 weeks, a grown man cried. But it was a different kind this time. It was the kind you cry when you've finally set something down. 2 weeks passed. For 2 weeks, nothing seemed to happen, and those were the hardest 2 weeks of Marcus Reed's life, because he had to go to work every day and sit in Ethan's old chair and act like a man who hadn't just handed a loaded weapon to the one person Victoria couldn't outpower. He processed paperwork. He said good morning. He nodded in meetings. And every time Victoria walked past his office, he was sure certain that she knew that this was the day that she'd stop and smile that smile and say Marcus a word. She never did. Because she didn't know. Because Eleanor Voss was very, very good at pulling threads quietly. What Marcus didn't see, because it happened in rooms he wasn't in, was that Eleanor Voss spent those 2 weeks doing exactly what a 71-year-old woman with nothing to fear and 40 years of respect in one city can do. She had the board's outside counsel, Harold Beck, a lawyer who'd been terrifying people in courtrooms since before Victoria Harrington got her MBA, quietly pull the classification records. Not ask Victoria for them. Pull them, independently. Through the board's authority, which superseded the CEO's effect, Victoria had spent years hoping everyone would forget. And Harold Beck's people found something Marcus's document only hinted at. They found the emails. Because here was the thing about Victoria Harrington. The flaw underneath all that control. She was so certain she'd never be questioned that she'd been careless in the one place she could afford to be careless least. She'd put it in writing. Months earlier, before any of this, she'd emailed the head of HR and the CFO a note about the restructuring, and in that note, in her own words, in a sentence that Harold Beck would later read aloud in a very quiet room, to a very quiet board, she'd written that the timing of the terminations should be optimized against vesting exposure to minimize legacy liability. Optimized against vesting exposure. 6 words. In her own hand. 6 words that translated in plain English to move the dates so we don't have to pay the pensions, and that no amount of emotional interpretation or disgruntled employees or personality conflicts could explain away. Because they weren't a rumor, and they weren't a memory, and they weren't 22 signatures from people she could call bitter. They were her, in writing, choosing it. Ethan had done the math from the appendix. Marcus had done the math from the records. But Victoria had written the confession herself months before either of them, and simply trusted that no one would ever have the standing to go looking. She'd been right about that for a long time. She'd just never counted on Eleanor Voss. The board met on a Thursday. Victoria walked into that meeting believing it was routine. She had no reason to think otherwise. She'd checked with her allies on the board that morning. She had 3 she considered reliable, and none of them knew anything, because Eleanor hadn't told them, because Eleanor knew which 3 would run straight to Victoria. Victoria sat down at the head of the table in her gold-framed confidence, and she opened with a smooth update on quarterly performance. And she got about 4 minutes in before Eleanor Voss said, "Victoria, stop." The room went quiet. Victoria smiled. "Eleanor, is there a problem?" "There's a document I'd like read into the record," Eleanor said. Harold, and Harold Beck, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table where Victoria had assumed he was there for some tedious compliance matter, opened a folder and began to read. He read the 6 words first. Optimized against vesting exposure to minimize legacy liability. He read the date of the email and the recipients and Victoria's name on the from line. Then he read the 47 names and the 47 original dates and the 47 altered dates and the 47 vesting deadlines, and he did the thing that no one in that room could look away from. He read them in 3s. Original date, altered date, vesting deadline, over and over, 47 times. And every single time the altered date fell on the wrong side of the line. By the 12th name, one of Victoria's reliable allies had stopped looking at her. By the 30th, another had put his head in his hands. Victoria Harrington sat at the head of the table, And for the first time in 22 years, she felt the thing she had spent her entire career making other people feel. She felt the floor move. She felt the math turn against her. She felt the specific, airless panic of a person who has just realized that the story they've been telling is no longer the story in the room. But she was Victoria Harrington. She didn't fold. Not yet. "This is," she said, and her voice was still level, still controlled, still that terrible calm. A wildly uncharitable reading of a standard financial optimization assembled by, let me guess, disgruntled former employees, coordinated by a man who abandoned his post and has an axe to grind. Ethan Carter. This has his fingerprints all over it. He's been feeding this to people for weeks, poisoning. Ethan Carter, Eleanor Voss said, has not set foot in this building since the day he resigned. He didn't build this document. He didn't organize these signatures. He didn't come to me. She let that land. The person who came to me is a current employee, your operations manager, the man you promoted, the man you handed the keys to precisely because you thought you'd bought him. Eleanor's eyes were cold. You were so busy making an example out of the man who said no that you gave the evidence to the man you thought had said yes. That's not Ethan Carter's revenge, Victoria. That's your own arrogance. You built a system that assumed everyone had a price, and you never once considered what happens when a man decides the price is too high. You have no idea what— I have your email, Eleanor said quietly. In your words, optimized against vesting exposure. I don't need to know anything else. Neither does a court. Neither does the Department of Labor. Neither does the reporter. Harold tells me has already started asking questions, which means this is coming out whether this board acts or not. The only question is whether we act like a company that caught its own problem, or a company that got caught. She folded her hands. So here is where we are. You can resign this morning, and we can announce that the restructuring is being reversed, and every affected employee made whole, and we can frame this as the board's oversight functioning as it should. Or you can fight it, and we can do all of the same things anyway, because I have the votes, Victoria. I counted them before you walked in, except with your name on the front page of it. Those are the two doors. Choose. And Victoria Harrington understood in that moment that she had lost. Not because she'd been outmaneuvered by a fired manager. Not because of some brilliant scheme. She'd lost because a quiet man had read the appendix and refused once out loud. And that refusal had traveled to Dolores, to Marcus, to 22 signatures, to Eleanor Voss, to a lawyer, to her own email. And now it was sitting on the table in front of her, 47 names deep, and there was no smile in the world that could make it go away. She had ruled by knowing everyone's number, and she had finally met a room full of people who'd stopped telling her theirs. "I'd like a moment," Victoria said. Her voice had changed. There was a crack in it now, small but real, the same crack that had appeared for half a second the day Ethan set his badge down. "You've had 22 years of moments," Eleanor Voss said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than cruelty. "Take one more, then choose your door." Victoria Harrington resigned that afternoon. It didn't make the news the way she'd feared, because Eleanor made sure it didn't have to. The board moved fast, reversed the restructuring, reinstated all 47, made every pension whole, and got out ahead of the reporter with a statement about a board-led correction. Dolores kept her insurance. Her husband kept his dialysis. The two night shift supervisors who'd been there since before the company had its name got the retirements they'd earned. 47 families who'd been 11 days and 6 days and 19 days from losing everything got to keep it, and most of them never knew the whole story. Never knew about the 2 a.m. legal pads, or the meeting in Eleanor Voss's office, or the 6 words in Victoria's own email. But some of them knew part of it. Some of them knew that it started with a man who set his badge on a table and walked out back when everyone thought he was a fool. Marcus Reed found out about Victoria's resignation the way everyone else did, an all-staff email carefully worded thanking her for her years of service and announcing a leadership transition. He read it 3 times in Ethan's old chair. Then he got up and he walked down to the warehouse floor and he found Dolores at her station, and he didn't say anything, he just showed her the email on his phone. Dolores read it. Her hands were shaking. "Is it real?" she asked. "Is it actually?" "It's real," Marcus said. "Your whole Dolores. Your date got fixed. Your insurance is safe. Your husband's dialysis is safe. All 47, it's done." And Dolores Whitfield, 19 years on that floor, put her hand over her mouth and made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and then she grabbed Marcus Reed and hugged him so hard he nearly lost his balance. And around them, the floor started to figure out what had happened, and a kind of low roar went up, the sound of 47 people, and everyone who loved them, realizing at once that the thing they'd thought was inevitable had been stopped. Marcus let himself have about 10 seconds of it. Then he pulled back and he said, "It wasn't me, Dolores. You know that, right? I built the document, but I only built it because you walked into my office and put your letter on my desk and told me to untake it. And you only did that because Ethan said the word dates." Dolores finished quietly. "In that meeting. Because Ethan never overreacts, and Ethan looked scared, and I couldn't stop thinking about it." She wiped her eyes. "He knew, 2 weeks before any of us. He read the thing nobody reads, and he did the math, and he told the truth in a room full of people who called him crazy for it, and then he just went home. Didn't fight. Didn't leak. Didn't come back to prove anything. He just told the truth once and trusted it'd find us." She looked at Marcus. "Does he know? Does Ethan know it worked?" And Marcus realized, standing there on the warehouse floor, that Ethan didn't. Ethan didn't know any of it. Ethan had handed him 2 sets of legal pad pages 3 weeks ago and sent him to Eleanor Voss and gone back to making grilled cheese and helping his daughter with fractions and waiting for a job that started in a few weeks. Ethan had let go of it so completely that he'd never once asked how it turned out, because to Ethan, the whole thing had ended the day he set his badge on the table. Everything after that was other people's to carry, and he'd meant it. He'd actually meant it in a way almost nobody means anything. "No," Marcus said slowly. "I don't think he does." Dolores looked at him. "Then I think about 30 people ought to go tell him," she said. That evening, Ethan Carter was standing at his kitchen counter making grilled cheese. He'd genuinely gotten very good at it when Lily at the table with a worksheet looked up toward the front window and said, "Dad, why are there so many cars?" Ethan turned, and through the front window he could see them pulling up. Not 1 car, not 2. A line of them filling the modest street of the blue house that still needed painting. Parking along both curbs and people getting out. People he knew, people he'd worked beside for 12 years. Faces he recognized from the warehouse and dispatch and the night shift. Dolores was at the front, and behind her Marcus, and behind them, more than he could count, the same people who 3 weeks ago had believed he was a fool, a hothead, a cautionary tale, a man who'd blown up his life for nothing. They came up his walk, dozens of them, and they stopped at his door, and Dolores was crying before he even opened it, and Marcus was standing just behind her with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. Ethan opened the door. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Dolores said in a voice that barely held together, "We thought you left us." And Ethan Carter looked at the crowd on his lawn, at the people whose pensions were safe, whose insurance was safe, whose retirements and mortgages and children's futures were safe, and who had no idea until this moment that the whole thing had started with him and something moved in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in 3 weeks. But all he said was, "I know." "Why didn't you tell us?" Dolores said. "Why didn't you fight? Why didn't you come back? And you knew the whole time you could have been the one who—" And Ethan, standing in the doorway of the small house he'd protected with 6 years of a truck that embarrassed him, gave her the answer that was the truest thing about him. The thing Victoria Harrington had never understood, and Eleanor Voss had recognized from across a document, and Marcus Reed had learned at 2 in the morning. "Because I didn't leave to prove I was right," Ethan said quietly. "I left because I knew what was right. Those are different things, and the second one doesn't need an audience." They didn't leave for a long time. Ethan invited them in. Not all of them fit, of course, dozens of people in a small blue house, so most of them stood on the lawn and the porch and spilled out onto the sidewalk, and Lily stood beside her father in the doorway, with wide eyes watching grown adults she half recognized wipe their faces on their sleeves. Dolores came in. Marcus came in. A few others. And they sat in Ethan's living room, the same room where he'd raised his daughter alone for 6 years, and they told him the whole thing because he genuinely didn't know it. He didn't know about Eleanor Voss reading the document with one finger going down the columns. He didn't know about the 6 words in Victoria's own email. When Marcus told him that part optimized against vesting exposure to minimize legacy liability, Ethan went quiet for a long moment, and then he said, almost to himself, "She wrote it down. She actually wrote it down." And Marcus said, "Yeah." And Ethan shook his head slowly and said, "That's the thing about people who've never been told no. They stop believing anyone ever will. They get careless because carelessness is a luxury you only have when you're sure you're untouchable." He didn't know that Victoria had resigned that afternoon. When Dolores told him, Ethan didn't smile. He didn't look triumphant. He looked, if anything, a little sad, and Lily noticed it and tugged his sleeve and whispered, "Dad, isn't that good? Isn't that the good part?" And Ethan put his arm around his daughter and said quietly enough that only she heard, "It's the right part, baby. Right and good aren't always the same feeling." And he didn't know this was the part that undid him. The part that got past the calm he'd worn like armor for 6 years. He didn't know that 47 families were whole again. That Dolores's husband would keep his dialysis. That the 2 old night shift supervisors would get to actually retire instead of getting robbed 11 days from the finish line. When Dolores said it, when she said, "Everybody's safe, Ethan, all 47. Everyone because of a thing you did 3 weeks ago that you never even asked about." Ethan Carter, who had not cried when he set his badge on that table, who had not cried in his driveway, who had held himself together through 12 years and a dead wife and a daughter, to raise alone, put his hand over his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then he took a breath, and he lowered his hand, and he said, "That's Marcus. That's Dolores. That's 22 people who signed their names when signing your name could have cost you everything. That's Eleanor Voss. I didn't do that. I closed a laptop and walked out of a room. You people did the hard part. Don't put it on me." But Marcus wasn't going to let him do that. Not this time. "Ethan," Marcus said. "Stop. Just stop for 1 second and let it be true." He leaned forward. "You want to give it all away. I know that's who you are. But I need you to hear this one thing because I've thought about it every single night for 3 weeks." He looked his old friend in the eye. "Everybody in that conference room did the same math you did. Everybody. We all knew on some level that something was wrong. You weren't the only smart person in that room. You were just the only one who'd made himself able to afford being right. That's the whole difference. Not brains. Not courage even. You just spent 6 years buying the one thing the rest of us never bought, and when the moment came, you could pay for your conscience. And we couldn't." The room was very quiet, and I keep thinking, Marcus went on, and his voice was thick now, about how I sat there, in that meeting, and I watched you set the badge down, and part of me, God forgive me, part of me was relieved it was you and not me. Because I couldn't have done it. I had $11,000 in debt, and a boat, and a number she could read across the room, and I could not have set that badge down, and I hated myself for it, and I took your chair the next morning anyway. He wiped his face. "You didn't just save 47 people, Ethan. You showed one coward what he could have been. And it took me 13 days and a woman with a husband on dialysis to catch up to you. But I caught up, and I wouldn't have if you hadn't gone first." Ethan looked at his friend for a long moment. "You're not a coward, Marcus," he said quietly. "I was. You were. Past tense. And then you weren't. And the whole thing turned on the day you decided to stop." Ethan almost smiled. "You know what I told you that night you came here with the pages I told you late still counts. And I meant it. My father never got to decide at all. You decided. That's not the story of a coward, Marcus. That's the story of a man who was scared and did the right thing anyway, which is the only kind of brave that actually exists. The other kind, the kind that isn't scared, that's not brave, that's just not paying attention." Dolores, sitting on the edge of the couch, said softly, "My husband wanted me to tell you something." Ethan turned to her. He said, Dolores began, and then she had to stop and collect herself. He said to tell you that a man he's never met just gave him 3 more years with his wife. Because if I'd lost that insurance if the dialysis had stopped. She couldn't finish it. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room understood the arithmetic of it, the terrible math that Victoria had been so willing to do on a spreadsheet without ever once picturing the man on the other end of the numbers. He said to tell you he's going to remember your name for the rest of his life. However long that is now. Because of you, it's longer. Ethan Carter had spent 6 years learning to let feelings visit without letting them drive. This one drove. He didn't sob. That wasn't him. But something broke open in his face. Some door he kept shut, even from himself, and for a moment, the calm man that everyone leaned on wasn't calm. He was just a person sitting in his living room, understanding for the first time the full weight of what one refusal had done. He looked at Dolores, and he opened his mouth and nothing came out, and Lily. 10 years old, watching her father's face, do a thing she'd never seen it do, climbed into his lap the way she hadn't in years, and put her arms around his neck, and Ethan held on to his daughter and let the moment drive for exactly as long as it needed to. Then slowly, the calm came back, not as armor this time, just as him. Tell your husband, Ethan said, his voice rough, that he doesn't owe me anything. Tell him to use the years. That's the only thanks I want. Use every single one of them and don't waste a day of it thinking about Victoria Harrington or Harrington Global or any of this. You got the years back. Go live them. Dolores nodded, unable to speak. They stayed until it got dark, and then they left one carful at a time, and each of them shook Ethan's hand or hugged him at the door, and some of them tried to say things and couldn't, and Ethan just nodded and said their kids' names because he knew all their kids' names. He always had. That was the whole reason he could never have signed that document in the first place. You can't backdate a man's pension when you know his daughter's in nursing school. You can't optimize against vesting exposure when you know the man on the night shift has a granddaughter he's raising. The numbers stop being numbers. The second you know the names, and Ethan had always known the names. That was his whole crime in Victoria's world. He knew the names. When they were all gone, Lily helped him clean up the coffee cups. There were a lot of coffee cups, and as she carried them to the sink, she said, "Dad, all those people. They came to our house. They were crying." "Yeah, baby. Because of the thing you did, when you left your job, when I thought we got poor." She set the cups down carefully. "That wasn't us getting poor. That was you saving all those people." Ethan crouched down to her level. "It was both," he said honestly. "That's the part I want you to understand because it's the whole thing. When I walked out of that room, I didn't know it would work. I didn't know Dolores would call anybody. I didn't know Marcus would come to the house with those pages. For all I knew, I'd walked out and nothing would happen, and 47 people would lose their pensions anyway, and I'd just be a guy who quit his job for nothing." He looked at his daughter steadily. "I didn't do the right thing because I knew it'd work out. I did it because it was right whether it worked out or not. Those are different, Lily. And most people only do the right thing when they're sure it'll pay off, and that's not really doing the right thing. That's just making a smart bet." Lily thought about this the way she thought about fractions. "So you might have lost everything for nothing," she said slowly. "And you did it anyway." "I might have. And I did it anyway. Because the version of me that would have signed that paper, that guy would have kept his job and his salary and his everything, but he wouldn't have been somebody you could be proud of. And I'd rather be broke and yours than rich and somebody else's." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You understand?" Lily nodded slowly, and then she said something that Ethan would carry for the rest of his life. Something a 10-year-old shouldn't have been able to see, but somehow did. "That's why you never let anybody know our number," she said. "So nobody could ever make you sign the paper." Ethan Carter stared at his daughter. He had never told her that. Not in those words. He'd told her about saving, about the trampoline turning into today, about fewer pieces being bigger pieces. But he'd never once said the thing Marcus had needed a 2 a.m. breakdown to understand, the thing Victoria had never grasped in 22 years, the thing that was the actual engine of the whole story. Don't let them know your number, and they can't make you afraid. His 10-year-old had just said it back to him. On her own. Where did you learn that? He asked quietly. From you, Lily said like it was obvious. You didn't say it. But it's the whole thing. It's why we drive the old truck. It's why we never got the trampoline. So nobody knows how much we have, so nobody can figure out what we can't lose. She shrugged a small 10-year-old shrug. It's just math, Dad. Fewer things you can't afford to lose, more free you are. It's the same as the pizza. Fewer pieces, bigger pieces. And Ethan Carter, who had spent 6 years quietly building a door where no one could see it, understood in that moment that he'd built something else too without meaning to. He'd built it into his daughter. Not the savings account, the understanding. The thing his own father had taught him by accident, by failing by signing the paper and living with it for 30 years. Ethan had taught it to Lily by succeeding, by refusing, by living it in front of her every single day, in a house that needed painting, and a truck that started on the second try. His father's lesson had cost his father everything and taken 30 years to sink in. Ethan's daughter had it at 10. That was the inheritance. Not money, never money. The thing you build so that when someone says, do it my way or quit, you can build the door and walk through it. His father had died wishing he'd had that door. Ethan had built one. And now watching his daughter dry a coffee cup and explain his own life philosophy back to him without being taught it in words. He understood that she'd have a door too, always for the rest of her life, because she'd grown up inside the proof that it could be built. Come here, Ethan said, and he hugged his daughter, and over her shoulder he looked at the small blue house that needed painting, and for the first time, it didn't look small to him at all. 3 days later, Eleanor Voss called. Ethan didn't recognize the number, and he almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him pick up. A woman's voice, dry and precise, said, Mr. Carter, my name is Eleanor Voss. I sit on the board of Harrington Global, and I've spent the last several weeks cleaning up a mess that I'm told you're the reason we caught in time. I'd like to buy you lunch. Ethan was quiet for a second. Ms. Voss, I appreciate the call, but I didn't do much. Marcus, Mr. Carter, Eleanor interrupted, and there was something almost amused in her voice. I have spent 40 years in business, and in that time, I have learned to recognize exactly two kinds of people. The kind who take credit they don't deserve, and the kind who refuse credit they do. You're about to be the third person this month to tell me it was all somebody else, and I find it very tiresome, so let me save us both the trouble. Marcus Reed built the document. Dolores Whitfield organized the people. I pulled the trigger. All true. But none of it happens if a quiet operations manager doesn't close his laptop in a room full of frightened people and say, no, when no cost him everything. You lit the match. Mr. Carter, everyone else carried the fire. But somebody has to light the match, and in 22 years of watching Victoria Harrington, you're the only one who ever did. A pause. Now, lunch, Thursday. I'm told you like diner food. Ethan almost laughed. Marcus told you that. Marcus told me a great many things. He's very fond of you. Thursday, Mr. Carter. There's something I'd like to discuss, and it isn't gratitude, so you won't be able to refuse it on the grounds of humility. They met at the diner, the same one as it happened where Ethan and Marcus used to get eggs before the early shift years ago, back when neither of them owned a suit. Eleanor Voss, 71 years old, and worth more than the diner had earned in its entire existence, ordered a patty melt and a black coffee and looked entirely at home. She got straight to it because that was how she did everything. The board is restructuring the real kind, not the Victoria kind, she said. New leadership, new oversight. And I've convinced them of something I've believed for a long time, which is that the reason a person like Victoria could do what she did for as long as she did is that there was no mechanism for anyone to say no. She built a culture where refusing an unethical order meant career suicide. Every person in that company knew that. It's why 47 pensions almost vanished with nobody stopping it. The only person who said no was a man who'd spent 6 years making himself unfireable by being unscarable, and men like that are 1 in 1,000. She fixed him with a look. So I want to build a mechanism, a policy, real teeth. Any employee at any level can refuse to carry out an order they believe to be unethical or illegal, formally in writing, with protection, real protection, board-level protection, that no CEO can override from retaliation. So that the next time there's a Victoria, a person doesn't have to have 6 years of savings to say no. So that saying no is something an ordinary scared in-debt person can afford to do. Ethan set down his coffee. "That's a good policy," he said quietly. "It's your policy," Eleanor said. "That's why you're here. I want you to help design it, and I want your name on it. And before you refuse, because I can see you winding up to refuse, I want you to think about your father." Ethan went still. "Marcus told me about him," Eleanor said gentler now. "The man who got put in a room just like yours 30 years ago and signed because he was scared and had a family and no runway and spent the rest of his life carrying it." She held his eyes. "That's the man this policy is for Mr. Carter. Not for you. You didn't need it. You built your own. This is for the men and women who can't build their own, who've got 11 days to a pension, and a boat they shouldn't have bought, and a number a CEO can read across a room. This is so that a scared man with debt and a family can do the right thing without having to be a hero to do it. This is so the next father doesn't have to sign." And Ethan Carter, who had refused a promotion, refused the credit, refused every attempt anyone had made to make him the center of this story, found that he could not refuse this. Because Eleanor Voss had found the one thing he couldn't say no to. She'd found his father. "Yeah," Ethan said, and his voice wasn't quite steady. "Okay, yeah, I'll help you build it." Eleanor Voss smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and she raised her coffee cup slightly, an old woman's toast, and she said, "Good, because I already told the board it'd be called the Carter Rule, and it would have been terribly awkward if you'd said no." Ethan laughed, then a real one surprised out of him. "You named it before you even asked me. Mr. Carter." Eleanor said, "I'm 71 years old, and I've never once asked permission for a good idea. I find it slows things down considerably." But the story wasn't quite finished with its surprises. Because 2 weeks after that lunch on an ordinary Tuesday evening, there was a knock at the door of the small blue house, and Ethan opened it, and standing on his porch alone without the gold dress or the corner office or the 22 years of untouchable confidence was Victoria Harrington. She looked smaller than he remembered. Not physically, just smaller. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Lily appeared at Ethan's side, took one look at the woman on the porch, and with the unerring instinct of a child who's heard a name, said a certain way, went quiet, and slipped back inside. "I wasn't sure you'd open the door," Victoria said finally. "I wasn't sure you'd knock," Ethan said. She almost smiled at that. "May I have a few minutes? I'm not here to—" "I don't want anything. There's nothing left for me to want from you. I just—" And for the first time in the entire story, Victoria Harrington seemed to genuinely not know what to say. "I've been trying to understand something for 3 weeks, and I've realized the only person who can explain it to me is standing in this doorway. And I've never in my life asked anyone to explain anything to me. So this is difficult." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "There's coffee on," he said. "There's always coffee on." Victoria Harrington sat at Ethan Carter's kitchen table, the same table where a coward-turned-brave man had once laid out 22 signatures, the same table where a 10-year-old had learned that fewer pieces meant bigger pieces, and she wrapped her hands around a mug of ordinary coffee in a house that needed painting, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all. Ethan didn't rush her. He'd learned a long time ago that the most important things people say come after the silence, not before it. "I've fired 100 people in my career," Victoria said finally. "Maybe more. And I remember almost none of them. That's the truth, and I'm not proud of it, but it's the truth." They blur together. 100 faces asking for one more chance, and I gave the same speech every time, and it worked every time, and I stopped seeing them as people somewhere around year 5. She turned the mug slowly in her hands. "But I remember you. I've thought about you every single day for 3 weeks, and I finally understood why. and I need to say it out loud to the one person who will know whether I've got it right. Say it, Ethan said quietly. You didn't beg. She looked up at him. That's it. That's the whole thing. In 22 years, everyone begged. Everyone did the math. I wanted them to do, I can't afford this. I have a family. I have a mortgage, please. And every time they did that math out loud, they handed me the leash. Because the second a person tells you what they can't afford to lose, you own them. I built an entire career on that one fact. Give me 30 seconds with anyone's fear and I'll have them signing anything. Her voice tightened. And then there was you. And I did everything right. I read your file. I knew you were a single father. I knew you had one income and a mortgage and no runway and a little girl depending on you. I said it out loud in that room in front of 50 people. I know exactly what your situation is, and that sentence had never once failed me. Not once. In 22 years. She set the mug down. And you set your badge on the table and walked out. And I've spent 3 weeks trying to understand how a man in your exact situation did the one thing your situation should have made impossible. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he got up, refilled her coffee without being asked, and sat back down. You want to know the answer? He said. But I don't think you're going to like it. Because it's not a clever answer. It's not a strategy. It's the most boring answer in the world. Tell me anyway. I spent 6 years making sure the sentence wouldn't work. Ethan said. That's all. I know exactly what your situation is. You were right when you said it. You did know my situation, the parts you could see. Single father. One income. Mortgage. What you didn't know is that 6 years ago, I decided that someday, somebody like you was going to look at my life, do exactly the math you did, and try to use it against me. So I spent 6 years quietly making the math come out different. I drove a truck that embarrassed me. I said no to my own daughter more times than I can count. I put money away every single month into an account I was never allowed to touch, and I built it up until it said one thing. He looked at her. It said 14 months. 14 months of everything not changing. 14 months of being able to look at anyone who tried to use my daughter against me and say no. Victoria stared at him. You planned for me, she said slowly. 6 years before you ever met me. I didn't plan for you. I planned for the day. I didn't know your name. I didn't know it'd be 47 pensions. I didn't know it'd be a conference room with 50 people. Ethan leaned forward. But I knew the day would come. It comes for almost everybody sooner or later, the day somebody with power over you says do it my way or lose everything. Most people meet that day unprepared, and they sign because they have to, because their whole life is built, so that they can't afford not to. My father met that day 30 years ago, and he signed, and it broke something in him that never healed. I watched it my whole childhood, and I promised myself I'd meet my day ready. Your father, Victoria said quietly. He had a boss like you. Different name, same math. Put him in a room, told him to do something wrong, and reminded him he had a family, a mortgage, a kid me. And my father was the strongest man I ever knew, and he signed because he was trapped, and the worst part is, he was right to be scared. He didn't have a runway. He didn't have 14 months. He had a family that would have gone hungry, and he made the only choice a trapped man can make, and it cost him his soul, and he carried it until the day he died. Ethan's voice was steady, but there was iron in it now. So when you looked at me in that room and thought he's trapped, he'll sign, you weren't wrong to think it. You were just 30 years too late. Because you were looking at my father's son, and I'd spent my whole adult life making sure I'd never be trapped the way he was. Victoria was silent for a long time. I destroyed people like your father, she finally said. For 22 years. I found the ones who were trapped, and I used the trap. Her voice had gone very quiet. That's what I'm actually here to understand, isn't it? Not how you walked out. I understand how you walked out now. You built a door. I'm here because I need to understand what I was all those years if a door is all it took to make me powerless. And Ethan Carter gave her the truest, hardest thing he'd said to anyone in the whole story. You never had power, Victoria, he said. Not real power. You had leverage, and they're not the same thing, And I think somewhere inside, you always knew they weren't. Which is why you needed to feel it over and over. Why one company was never enough. Why you had to keep breaking people. Real power doesn't need to prove itself. You had leverage over people who couldn't afford to leave. And the second one person could afford to leave you had nothing. That's not power. That's just standing on people who can't stand up. And the moment they can stand up, you find out you were never actually tall. Victoria Harrington flinched. Not dramatically, just a small thing around the eyes. But it was the flinch of a person hearing a true thing they'd spent 22 years not letting themselves hear. "I offered you your job back," she said, "before all this came out. Do you remember?" "No, you wouldn't. It was through the board before I resigned. A promotion, a raise, more power. I was so sure that once the dust settled, you'd take it because everyone takes it. And you refused before I even finished the offer." She almost laughed, and there was something raw in it. "You refused power. From me, and I couldn't understand it. I lay awake over it. Who refuses power? Somebody who's already got the only kind that matters." Ethan said simply, "You were offering me leverage over other people. I don't want that. I never wanted that. The only power I've ever wanted is the power to say no when it counts, and I already built that. And it didn't cost me my soul. It cost me a trampoline and a nicer truck. That's the whole trade. That's the secret you spent 22 years never learning. The freedom to say no is cheap. It's just paid for slowly in small, boring installments over years, and almost nobody's patient enough to buy it." Victoria looked down at her coffee for a long moment. Then she said the thing she'd really come to say, the thing underneath all the other things. "I have money," she said. "More money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I have a house on a lake, and a house in the city, and a portfolio that survived my resignation just fine. By every number you could put on a spreadsheet, I won. I have everything." She looked up and her eyes were wet, and it was the strangest thing Ethan had ever seen, Victoria Harrington's eyes wet in his kitchen. "And I drove here tonight to a house that needs painting to ask a man who has none of it how he sleeps at night. Because I don't. I haven't in years. And I told myself it was stress, or the pressures of leadership, or 100 other things. But it's not. I finally know what it is." Her voice cracked. "It's that I have never once in my adult life done a single thing that I could tell a 10-year-old about, and have her be proud of me. Your daughter looked at me on that porch tonight, and slipped back inside. And she was right to. And I have everything, Ethan, and your daughter was right to walk away from me. And those 2 facts have been sitting in my chest for 3 weeks, and I can't get them out." The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan Carter looked at the woman across his table. The woman who'd tried to use his daughter against him, who'd tried to steal 47 pensions, who'd broken 100 people over 22 years. And he did not gloat, and he did not forgive her either, because forgiveness wasn't his to give on behalf of 47 families, and it wasn't the point. Instead, he did the thing that was in the end the deepest thing about him. He told her the truth, because she'd finally asked for it honestly. "It's not too late for you," Ethan said. "That's the part you came here hoping I'd say, and it's also true, so I'll say it. You're what, 45? You've got half a life left, and you've got resources my father never dreamed of. You could spend the second half of your life building the thing you never built in the first half." He held her eyes. "But I'm not going to pretend it's easy, or that saying it makes it done. You spent 22 years learning to read people's fear and use it. You're going to have to spend a long time unlearning it, and it's going to be humbling, and there won't be applause for it. And some nights you're going to want to go back to the version of you that at least got to feel powerful. The work of becoming someone your 10-year-old could be proud of, there's no promotion for it, no corner office, no award at a gala." He paused. "But it's the only work that's ever going to let you sleep. So that's the choice in front of you now. Same choice I had in that conference room. Same choice my father had 30 years ago. Same choice everybody gets eventually. Do it the easy way, the way that cost your soul, or do it the hard way, the way that cost your comfort. That's it. That's the only real choice there ever is." Victoria Harrington sat with that for a long time. Then she stood up. She smoothed the front of her jacket, an old reflex from a life of boardrooms, and she looked at Ethan, and she said, "Thank you for the coffee, and for not lying to me. I've had a great many people lie to me kindly. You're the first to tell me the truth kindly, and I think I finally understand there's a difference." She got to the door and stopped, one hand on the frame, and without turning around she said, "The Carter rule, Eleanor told me. The policy you're building so a scared person can say no without having to be a hero to do it." A pause. "That's the thing I should have built. With all my power, all those years. I could have built that, and I built the opposite." She turned then, and there was something almost like a smile on her face. The saddest smile Ethan had ever seen. "You built more with a truck that embarrassed you than I built with everything. I hope you know that. I hope your daughter always knows that." And then Victoria Harrington walked out of the small blue house, and Ethan Carter watched her taillights disappear down the modest street, and he never saw her again. But he heard years later that she'd given away most of her fortune quietly. No press, no gala, no plaque funding, legal defense for workers with nowhere else to turn. And he thought when he heard it that maybe some people do get to build the door late. Maybe late really does count. He hoped it did. For her sake, and for his father's, he hoped it did. The Carter rule took 8 months to build. Ethan worked on it with Eleanor Voss and Harold Beck and a rotating cast of lawyers, and he fought for every clause because he knew from the inside exactly how a policy like this dies. It dies in the fine print, in the exceptions, in the at management's discretion that quietly guts the whole thing. So he fought for teeth. Board-level protection no executive could override. A formal written process any employee at any level could invoke. Real consequences for retaliation. And one clause he insisted on personally over the objections of 2 lawyers who thought it was too broad a clause that said, an employee who refused an unethical order in good faith could not be terminated, demoted, or financially penalized while the matter was under review, so that no one would ever again have to choose between their paycheck and their conscience in the same terrible instant Ethan had faced, so that no scared man with debt would have to be a hero to do the right thing, so that no father would have to sign. The day it passed, the board unanimously, Eleanor Voss called him and said only, "It's done, it's real, it has teeth. Your father would be proud, Mr. Carter." And then she hung up before he could say anything, because Eleanor Voss did not do sentiment on the phone, and Ethan stood in his kitchen holding the phone and thought about a man who'd signed a paper 30 years ago because he had no other door, and he thought, there's a door now, Dad. There's a door now for all of them. Ethan didn't go back to Harrington. He took the job with Frank Delgado, the family-owned outfit where the owner still walked the floor and knew people's names, and it turned out to be the best job he ever had because it was a place where a man like Ethan Carter made sense, where knowing everybody's kids' names was considered a qualification instead of a weakness. Marcus stayed at Harrington under the new leadership and became the kind of manager Ethan had been, the kind who reads the appendix, who does the math, who knows the names. Dolores got her 19th year and her 20th, and her husband got his years too. All of them, and used everyone. And the small group who'd once thought Ethan Carter was a fool told the story so many times that it stopped being a rumor and became something closer to a legend. The kind of thing people tell new hires on their first day. You know why we've got the Carter rule? Let me tell you about a guy who closed his laptop. Years passed. And one evening when Lily was 16 and taller than her father and sharper than ever, she was doing homework at the same kitchen table, and she looked up and said, "Dad, can I ask you something I've wondered about for a long time? Always. When you walked out that day, when you set your badge down." She set her pen down. "You keep telling it like you were calm, like you weren't scared. And I've heard you tell it 100 times, and you always say you weren't afraid because you'd built the door." She looked at him. "But were you really in that exact second? Weren't you a little bit scared?" And Ethan Carter looked at his daughter, nearly grown now, and he decided she was old enough for the last, truest piece of it, the piece he'd never told anyone, not Marcus, not Eleanor, not even Victoria in that kitchen years ago. "I was terrified," he said quietly. Lily blinked. "I was more scared in that moment than I've ever been in my life," Ethan said. My hands were shaking under the table where nobody could see. My heart was going so hard I thought people could hear it. Because building the door doesn't mean you're not afraid, baby. That's the part people always get wrong when I tell the story. The savings account, the truck, the 14 months that didn't make me fearless. Nothing makes you fearless. I was every bit as scared as everyone else in that room. He held her eyes. The door doesn't remove the fear. The door just means you don't have to obey it. That's the whole difference. Marcus was scared, and he obeyed it for 13 days. My father was scared, and he obeyed it for 30 years. I was scared too, just as scared, but I'd built something that let me disobey the fear instead of the truth. That's all courage ever is. It's not the absence of fear. It's being just free enough to not do what the fear tells you. Lily was quiet for a long moment. So the whole time, she said slowly, the whole time you looked so calm, you were scared out of your mind. Out of my mind, Ethan agreed. And I did it anyway. And that anyway is the only part that ever mattered. Not the calm. The calm was just a face. The anyway was the man. Lily looked at her father across the table, and something passed between them. The thing that passes between a parent and a child when the child finally understands the whole shape of who their parent is. I'm going to build one, Lily said. A door. Mine. Starting now. I know you are, Ethan said. You've been building it since you were 10 and figured out why we drove the old truck. You just didn't have the word for it yet. He smiled. Build it slow. Build it boring. One small, boring installment at a time. And then one day somebody with power over you is going to look at your life, do the math, and decide you're too trapped to say no. His voice was steady and sure and full of everything he'd spent his life learning. And you're going to calmly, quietly, with your hands shaking under the table, where nobody can see, you're going to walk right through the door you built and say no, and be free. Because you'll have already paid for it. Because that's the one thing they can never take from you if you're patient enough to buy it in advance. He reached across the table and put his hand over his daughter's. Most people don't lose their values because they're weak, Lily. Remember that your whole life. They lose them because they're trapped. And freedom isn't something you suddenly find in the moment you need it. Freedom is something you quietly build long before, one small sacrifice at a time, until the day comes when someone says, do it my way, or quit, and you can look them in the eye scared to death and answer with the only word that was ever really yours to give. Lily looked at her father, this quiet man who had never been rich and never wanted to be, who had built a door out of a truck that embarrassed him and a trampoline they never bought, who had lit a match in a frightened room and changed 47 lives and never once asked for the credit. No, she said softly, trying the word out, understanding it fully for the first time. No. Ethan Carter agreed, and in that small blue house that still needed painting, a father and his daughter sat together at an ordinary kitchen table, and the truck outside was old and would start on the second try. And neither of them would have traded a single boring installment of it for all the corner offices in the world, because they had built the one thing no one could ever take from them, and they had built it themselves slowly on purpose, one quiet day at a time, and it had made them free.